Right, folks, we're looking at this book, and we've looked at methodology. Really, we've looked at reasons why we should study about Jesus. We've looked at are the Gospels reliable, etc. And if you're going to study the life of Jesus, one of the things that you need to begin to get your head around is the historical background to the life of Jesus. The first 400 years before Jesus' life are very significant, important in understanding first century Judaism, and also understanding the historical context of Jesus. And then, not to say the historical times of Jesus, what was going on politically, economically, all sheds light on who Jesus is, and is very valuable. First of all, Jesus was a Jew, and so if you're going to learn about Jesus, you need to understand Judaism in the first century. Now, this seems very obvious to you, but if you look at the history of scholarship, it's not been obvious to many scholars. They really didn't think this was an obvious thing, but luckily, unfortunately, things have changed. So they write here, there are two opposing errors regarding Jesus and the Jewish faith. One error has been to ignore Jesus' Jewish background and belief. So some people treat him as some sort of universal man whose Jewishness is irrelevant, and even attribute to him beliefs such as reincarnation that no Jew would have held. The other error is to treat Jesus as no more than any other Jew, teacher or rabbi, and no different from other preachers who wandered around the Palestine in those days. Jews believed one of the most distinctive features of the Jewish faith was that it believed that there was only one God. This Yahweh was the universal God whose power and authority were unlimited. The Jews also believed generally Yahweh was a God who spoke to his covenant people. There was this law of the Word of God. The Jews had the temple. The temple in Jerusalem played a central role in the faith of most Jews of Jesus' day, especially those who lived in Palestine. Ritual purity. An essential part of Jewish belief was the idea of ritual purity. The Sabbath on a day a week, Saturday, was kept as a holy day. The Sabbath on that day, no work would be done, and even non-work activities restricted. Feast. The Jewish calendar was marked by a number of major feasts. The Feast of the Passover in March or April, which was the celebration of the Israel from foreign slavery in Egypt in the events of Exodus. The Feast of Pentecost came 50 days after Passover, coinciding with the first grain harvest. It celebrated the giving of the law. The Feast of the Tabernacles occurred in October and commemorated the 40 years in Israelite, and the Feast of Dedication occurred in late November or December, commemorating cleansing of the temple in 165 BC. So all these feasts would have been in the mind of Jesus and part of the culture, of the Gospel writers. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to understand the Gospels correctly. You had power and politics and pressure in this time. The spread of Greek culture into Palestine was due to Alexander the Great to 356-323. So you need to understand that there was a whole issue of Greek culture's influence on Judaism. After the collapse of Alexander's empire, Palestine came under the rule of Hellenistic dynasties. The last of these rulers, Antiochus IV, declared himself a god and looted the temple. Unsurprisingly, in 167 BC, the Jews rebelled. The result was what became called the Maccabean Revolt, for the name of one of its leaders, Judas Maccabeus. The success of this rebellion eventually led to an 80-year period of Jewish independence. Impact. Hellenization affected almost every area of life in Palestine. Greek architecture, medicine, philosophy, art and science became important. Greek dress became fashionable, and the Greek language became widely spoken. Sometimes Hellenization was imposed, but it also spread of its own accord. If we were uplevel and mobile, the Greeks' way of doing things was very attractive, and the key to jobs, education, trade, progress up the social ladder. In Jesus' day, the influence of Greek culture was unavoidable. Even in Galilee, 4 miles to the north of Nazareth, lay the Greek-style town of Sepphoris, which was being rebuilt in the early part of the 1st century. We are told that Jesus' stepfather Joseph was a carpenter, and as Jesus followed his trade, he may have worked there and often exposed to Greek culture. Attitude among the Jews to Hellenization varied. Some aspects of it were recognized as harmless or even welcome. Others were much debated. For instance, Greek athletics required nudity, and Greek education involved pagan philosophy. To what extent could any real Jew get caught up with either? Some aspects of Hellenization were definitely considered evil by more religious Jews, such as the Greek temples and theatres. You have Roman power. When the Romans took over Palestine in 63 BC, they followed what was by now standard operating procedure. They looked for suitable local kings who they could control and got them to do their dirty work. With time, Herod's weariness darkened into homicidal paranoia. He murdered many people, most notably an uncle, 2 high priests, a mother-in-law, 3 sons, including an heir, and his wife. Herod occurs in Matthew's account of the wise men seeking the infant Jesus, and the picture of him there, paranoid, deceiving, sensitive about this Jewishness, and brutal enough to mask infants in true life. Herod died in 4 BC. Excuse me. Impact. By Jesus' time, a large full-scale time army held the sprawling Roman Empire together. This army had to be paid, and that meant the conquered states had to pay heavy taxes. The Jewish response. The twin threats of Greek culture and Roman power produced a crisis in Judaism. It was impossible to carry out the requirements of law in a land run by Romans and full of Greek influence. At this time there were several different responses to this crisis. One response was that of separation, of trying to be distinctly different from those around you. This was the policy of the Pharisees, a group who are prominent in the Gospels. Excuse me. A second response to the crisis in Judaism was the concession of coming to terms with the way things were. This was the policy of the Sadducees, a group that the Pharisees saw as their main opponents. We know little about the Sadducees, but they were higher up in social scale than the Pharisees, and were based in Jerusalem, where they maintained a profitable control of the temple. The third response to the crisis facing the Jews of the Palestine of Jesus' day was that of rebellion. Many groups and individuals believed that the only solution to the crisis was to repeat the strategy of the Maccabean revolt and remove the Romans by force. The best known of such groups were the Zealots, who were heavily involved in guerrilla fighting against Rome in the war of AD 66-73. Although the Zealot party did not formally exist at the time of Jesus, there were many who held to rebellion as the answer. So if you even just going to get into the study of Jesus and his life, you've got to get that background in your mind, that Jesus was born and lived in the Roman Empire in 1st century Judaism, that it had been influenced by Hellenistic culture, that there had been a reaction by some Jews, such as the Pharisees, against this Hellenistic culture. And if you don't understand these historical backgrounds, you're going to struggle in fully understanding the life of Jesus, and you're going to struggle in being able to answer these critics who will come up and criticize the Gospels. So you need to familiarize yourself with what the period was like. Best way to do that is read the books by Josephus, the Jewish historian of the times, and that will give you a picture of what was going on. Alright, thank you for listening, and take care.